Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to introduce my tennis opponent often in recent years, Paul McBride, but we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Paul and what he's going to talk to us about, which is the story of two generations, what Tom Brokaw called the greatest generation, and then their offspring, the baby boomers. Now, Paul has a unique vantage point for this lecture because he's a member of neither generation. So he's not great, he doesn't boom, you know. He was born before the war, whereas of course the baby boomers were born after the war, when Johnny came home again. But Paul graduated from college in 1963, Youngstown, a proud alum of Youngstown University, Ohio. And he bounced around for a little bit, went to Vietnam as a medical officer, came back, decided he hadn't liked what he'd seen, and was active in the anti-Vietnam War politics thereafter. Finally decided he wanted to be a teacher, took degrees in history, and then began teaching at Ithaca College in 1970 and continued for 31 years. His area of specialty was 20th century American history, specializing in labor relations, specializing in immigration, but really covering many subjects during that time. Graduating or leaving Ithaca in 2001, fetching up here at the Forest at Duke about 6 years ago, and all of us who know Paul and Linda know what a contribution they have made to the community here with their active involvement and their can-do volunteer spirit. So it's wonderful that all of you are here to hear Paul, and without further ado, let me turn it over to him. Professor.
Well, Dennis, the best thing that I heard from that was that you weren't going to go into the tennis and discuss my unsavory tennis tactics and my totally unrepentant line calls. And I'm going to begin this, my goodness. Thank you so much for showing up on this beautiful day when being out for a walk would be a good thing too. I'm going to start my talk today quite unexpectedly with a letter that Bill Losey just gave me that was written in 1944 when Bill was 8 years old. The letter came from his father, who had been in World War II and was in the Philippines. And he writes, "Dear Billy, well, in a couple of days you'll be 8 years old. May 4th is the day, and your dad wishes that he could be home to give you a big kiss and a nice present, perhaps even have ice cream and cake with you and Steve. However, we know that I can't be with you, so you think of me and I'll think of you. Yes, you can have my plate of ice cream, but you've got to eat it all. Remember, no waste. Billy, you're getting to be a very big boy now, and I'm very proud of you. I always want to be, and so I know that you will listen to Mother and do as she tells you, won't you? I can remember the day 8 years ago when you came to us, and I was so happy and proud to have a son, and now you've grown so big. Why, you even write me wonderful letters. Thank you for the one Mother brought to me. It was 100% perfect. Keep up the good work. It certainly was wonderful to see your mother on Sunday. He was in the Philippines, I think I mentioned. She looked just beautiful. As beautiful as ever, and told me all about you and Steve and what you're doing. I know that she will tell you all about how I am and what I'm doing. In 10 months, I hope to be home for a week's leave, and then we can all go to the beach. This is all for now. Read this letter to Steve, and happy birthday to you, Billy. I know that you will have a good time. Goodbye for now. To both my sons from their dad, who loves them very much. Well, I'm going to talk about the generation gap that has created fault lines through all of our lives. There are some here who personally represent the generation that came of age during the Great Depression and World War II and lived on during the Cold War and taxed themselves heavily to create an infrastructure of a modern nation and lived then in one of the most prosperous periods of American life. And oftentimes their own children, who came of age in a very different period, developing altogether different views of the world in which they lived and creating different values and passionate attachments to causes that their parents' generation found puzzling and even threatening. I know that many students of history have come across this quote that I will share with you in a moment and gotten a big chuckle out of it because it hits so many nails right on the head. What is happening to our young people? They disrespect their elders. They disobey their parents. They ignore the law. They riot in the streets inflamed with wild notions. Their morals are decaying. What's to become of them? The author was Socrates. And so there's something endemic, if not pandemic, about a generation gap. But the generation gap that has cleaved our own lives goes well beyond that. Anybody growing up slowly comes to the realization that they have their own mind and that their parents are trying to imprison them. And maybe their parents don't know anything. And it takes a while to get over that. Well, I'm going to introduce you to two people that will walk with us through our lives this afternoon. One is Tom, who was born in 1920, almost certainly would have gone to World War II when it broke out on December 7th of 1941 for the United States. And his daughter, Judy, who was born in 1948, a baby boomer. Tom was 13 years old when Franklin Delano Roosevelt told the American people, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And his daughter was 13 years old when John Fitzgerald Kennedy told the American people, ask not what your country can do for you. Ask what you can do for your country. And the years that they lived through as they formed their values and their passions and their loves turned out they couldn't have been more starkly different. So Tom, born in 1920, was 13 when FDR was inaugurated in 1933, March of 1933. Now, when he was 9 years old and Herbert Hoover had become president, I'm sure he wasn't paying much attention to politics. I mean, when the stock market crashed, I suspect that Tom wouldn't have even known what the stock market was. But by 1933, when he's 13, he knew what the Depression was. If he was born in Youngstown like I was, his dad probably worked in the mill. And when times were good, his dad worked 12-hour days. And every 2 weeks he was on a double shift. He changed from the one shift to the other and worked 24 hours straight, and when he came home from that 24-hour nightmare, he was a zombie. But he was making money. But by 1932, he wasn't working 12 hours. The company had cut him to about 20 hours with a commensurate cut in his pay. And his family was struggling. And now this new guy, Roosevelt, is president, and my guess is that Tom would have been paying some attention. I mean, after all, the first thing he announced was that he was closing all the banks. Hundreds and hundreds of banks had already failed. People were streaming to the banks to take their money out because the banks weren't reliable anymore. And Roosevelt closed them all, called it a holiday. And a week later, in his first fireside chat, he announced that the government had overlooked all the banks. They were solid. They were going to open up tomorrow. And I wouldn't be surprised if Tom's dad took the meager family savings that they had and went back to the bank to put his money in. Tom's older brother probably also worked for the steel mills. And in just a few years, he was a proud member of the United Steelworkers Union. The steel mills had been one of the most ferocious opponents of labor unions. And then this administration, the government, had backed unionization with the Widener Labor Relations Act. His dad could hardly believe that. He talked about it all the time, and so did his older brother. And it forced the corporations to negotiate in good faith, and it guaranteed the rights of workers to organize a union and collectively bargain. And in just a couple of years, while the Depression rolled on and the New Deal did, it wouldn't have been surprising if Tom himself ended up in a CCC camp. Didn't pay much. I think it was about $20 a month. But 15 of it went back to mom and dad. And in that first year, the New Deal established the Civil Works Administration. It was only in operation for that one winter. And people were working in government jobs, putting in roads in cities and other things, and they got a paycheck. And when that first paycheck came out, you couldn't buy a pair of kids' shoes in any town in America because everybody was going to get their kids' shoes so they wouldn't have to go to school with cardboard to cover the holes. Now, it wasn't that FDR was not controversial. He was very controversial. But if you were a common person like Tom and his family, you kind of liked him for his enemies. His enemies were the bankers. Arlo Guthrie had a very popular song out then. I'm a jolly banker am I. I'm going to foreclose on your home. And so the bankers hated him because the government agencies was forcing them to open their books to government oversight. The Wall Street financiers hated him because all of a sudden there was a Securities Exchange Commission, government agency that was looking over their shoulders. And so if you come from Tom's family in this period, living through the Depression was tough, but you came out with certain perceptions. One of them was that it wasn't a bad idea that the government was behind the people. And so as you lived through the Depression, you didn't hate your country. Your relationship with your country, for the most part of America, deepened rather than frayed. And we allied very quickly, almost imperceptibly, until December 7th, 1941, into the most terrible war in world history. And again, young men by the millions lined up to serve their country under their commander-in-chief, Franklin Roosevelt. And when the war was over, again, the relationship between the American citizenry and their country and their president and their government had deepened. And they were proud, and justifiably so, in the performance of the United States in the greatest war in history. And so Tom would have lived through Depression and war and came out in 45. By the way, in 1945, when Franklin Roosevelt died, Tom, who was 13 when we opened this, was now 25. He had just been peeking over into the teenage years when FDR became president, and at age 25, Franklin Roosevelt was the only president he had ever known. And he was followed by Harry Truman. Boy, the Republicans were just ecstatic. Harry Truman. To err is Truman. They were at last going to take revenge and get rid of the New Dealer weirdo leftists who had taken over the country since 1933. They were chomping at the bit. In 46, they took over Congress. They elected a senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy. But a senator from from Massachusetts named John Fitzgerald Kennedy. But in 46, there was a massive takeover by the Republicans in Congress, and man, they were out to get the Democrats and get rid of these New Dealers. And by 48, it was a foregone conclusion. Thomas E. Dewey was going to be the next president of the United States. Every pundit believed it. It was all over the newspapers, and it didn't happen. It might not have happened in part because of Alice Longworth Roosevelt. She was the same one that when Calvin Coolidge died in the middle of the 20s, her remark was, "How could they tell?" And regarding Thomas E. Dewey, her remark was, "He looks like the bridegroom on a wedding cake." But if we hadn't had that 1948 upset, let me suggest to you that we might not have had anything that closely resembled the McCarthy era. Because he was taken off after the Democrats. He was taken off after Dean Acheson. He was taken off after Harry Truman. What the devil were we stuck with Harry Truman still? And so the Republican leadership, all of them, who were smart enough to know that all of this was badly exaggerated by the late 40s, there were as many FBI agents in the Communist Party as there were members. I'm kidding. But it was fairly nip and tuck. Anyway, if Dewey had been elected, I can't imagine that people like Robert Taft from Ohio and other Republican leaders wouldn't have taken McCarthy aside and said, "Would shut the hell up." And indeed, they couldn't do that because he was taken off after the Democrats, but after Eisenhower was elected, he wouldn't shut up. He made war on the Army, for God's sakes. The Army McCarthy hearings, everybody tuned into them. And Eisenhower called on Richard Nixon, his vice president, who had come out of the Senate, and said, "We got to shut this guy up." And the result was that the Republicans joined the Democrats in censoring Joseph McCarthy. But for Tom, our fellow walker here, he had lived through the Great Depression, the war. He was into the Cold War. And only 5 years after the war was over, we're at war again. It was a hot war in Korea. And he came out of that understanding, appreciating, and glorifying in the relationship that he personally felt and his generation felt between themselves and their government and their country. And if you look at the cultural life, I mean, I would guess that his two favorite movies of all time, or three, I'll put a third one in, was It's a Wonderful Life with Jimmy Stewart, The Best Years of Our Lives, which came out immediately after the war, and talked about the soldiers and what they faced in trying to rejoin normal society. And almost certainly Gone with the Wind. The songs, every time he heard Glenn Miller's Moonlight Serenade or Chattanooga Choo Choo or In the Mood, it brought the whole war back because Glenn Miller was the band of the American military. He was in the military, died during the war in a plane accident. I suspect, too, that Tom would have known the words by heart to Stardust. I'm sure that he would have enjoyed the Mills Brothers. Paper doll. I'm going to buy myself a paper doll to call my own. A doll that other fellows cannot steal. And, and the flirty guys with the flirty eyes will have to find a real doll. Well, or the Andrews sisters, the boogie woogie bugle boy of Company B. The songs, the actors, the movies of his life, I think we're pretty safe in guessing what I'm guessing. His daughter, Judy, was born in 1948. My guess would be that when he found out he was going into the Army, he probably quickly got married to a sweetheart. And so whether he was on leave or whatever, she comes along in 48, 13 years later. Just like her father, when he was 13, a new president was coming into office, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. My guess is, too, that in the years before John Fitzgerald Kennedy was inaugurated, I don't think that Judy paid much attention to Paul. I mean, what was there about Dwight David Eisenhower that would excite a 13-year-old girl? But this Kennedy bunch, John Fitzgerald Kennedy was handsome as the devil. He didn't come here, he came here. His wife, Jackie was a goddess overnight. I mean, she wore those pillbox hats, and her hair was always perfectly coiffed, and the shoes she wore, every girl in America knew what she was wearing. And John and Caroline. In 1963, when Vaughn Meader came out with his long-playing record, The First Family, Judy was among the first to buy it. I was hoping I could bring my copy. I couldn't find it. I've got it still. There was one part of the record that you heard footsteps going up the steps. Click, 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 click. And finally, you hear a knock on the door, and the door opens, and Lady Bird answers. And she says, John, how are you? And he says, can Lyndon come out and play? Vaughn Meader didn't survive November 22nd, 1963. And so, Judy is a 13-year-old kid. The Kennedys were exciting. At one point, Kennedy comes out and he says, the American people are getting fat and lazy. We need to get in shape. He said, every American should be able, well, up to a certain age, should be able to walk 50 miles. And by God, all over the country, coast to coast, people were going on 50-mile hikes. I was teaching high school at Jackson Milton High School, which is a rural area just outside of Youngstown at the time. And one Saturday morning, our phone rings, and it's my kids from school. They had walked all the way in from Jackson Milton to downtown Youngstown, and we're walking back out, and we're walking up Mahoning Avenue, which goes straight out to Jackson Milton, and they were pooped. So they called and asked me if they could stop at our place and maybe we could give them a glass of water. So we ran out real quick. My first wife and I, we bought some ice cream and some other things, and we treated them, and they were whipped. And so I piled them all in my car, and I drove them back out to Jackson Milton. Judy could have done just that kind of thing. It was exciting to be young, with a young president, with young kids and a beautiful wife in the White House. I went to school one morning, and the girls in my classes were breaking down and crying. The Cuban Missile Crisis had been announced by the president last night on TV, and many of them had boyfriends who were in some phase of the military. Their units had been put on strike alert. And it wasn't clear when they'd get back home or if they'd get back home. So living through those first years of the Kennedy administration for someone young must have been both exciting and inspirational. But on November 22nd, 1963, the 1950s ended, and the 1960s began. And it was one long nightmare. So, at age 13, Judy is becoming all excited about her country and her president and the First Lady. And when she's 15, he's gone. 5 years later, she's a sophomore in college. She's become interested in the civil rights movement. She's become interested in what's going on in foreign policy. And in April of that year, Martin Luther King is assassinated. And only 2 months later, Bobby Kennedy is killed after winning the California primary in an attempt to become the successor of Lyndon Baines Johnson. And I don't know if she was kind of like me or not, but when I heard Lyndon Johnson speaking to a joint session of Congress on behalf of the Voting Rights Act, and this tall Texan in his strong Southern accent on behalf of voting rights for all Americans, finished his speech with the words, "We shall overcome," I'd have followed him anywhere. And yet, by 1968, I was out of the service. I was back from Vietnam. I had been active in the anti-war movement. And it got to where when I heard him come on TV, and he started out the same way, "My fellow Americans," my skin would crawl. It's why when I got to Ithaca College sometime later and began to teach in 20th century, I didn't trust myself to teach a course on Vietnam because I was so emotionally wrapped up in it. And so I didn't try that until the mid-'80s. And it was the most popular course I taught because the Vietnam War had cut through families like some kind of a terrible weapon. And the kids didn't get any information about it in high school. And so when I started off with the course, it was packed every semester. Many of the kids having been touched by it in terrible ways. One young woman followed me back from class one day and told me that the previous summer, her boyfriend's father had committed suicide. And by that time, we had lost as many soldiers to suicide as we had in the war itself. So I don't know about Judy, but my guess is that when finally in March of that year, the end of March, after he almost lost the primary in New Hampshire, he beat Eugene McCarthy in New Hampshire by 230 votes, an incumbent president. Holy Moses. So when he announced that he wasn't going to run, my guess would be that Judy would have some encouraging thoughts. Maybe we're going to get out of this mess after all. 4 days later, Martin Luther King was shot and killed. So living through these 60s, she's still a young kid, just gotten into her 20s. It was awful. The same month that Martin Luther King was assassinated, the students took over Columbia University. All hell broke loose in Columbia. Universities and colleges across the country were hotbeds of anger and disillusionment. In September, there was a Miss America contest, and it was boycotted by thousands of women from the National Organization of Women who were saying it's time to stop treating women like meat. Is nothing sacred? In early August, we had the Republican National Convention, and here comes Richard Nixon. And at the end of August, no matter where we were in America, we went to Chicago. And living through those hours of the Chicago Convention, that was tough stuff. At one point, all hell had broken loose on the streets, and Abe Ribicoff got up on the dais. He was supposed to give a nominating speech, and 3 rows down in front of him was Richard Daley, the mayor of Chicago. And Ribicoff said something about, "We've got to stop these Gestapo tactics on the street." By that time, there had already been fistfights breaking out on the floor. Dan Rather was talking to Cronkite in the booth, and he got punched in the stomach by a security guard. He was being ushered out, And Cronkite on network TV said, "We've got thugs down on the floor." And so when Ribicoff made his remarks, Richard Daley stood up and he said, "Forgive me." He said, "Fuck you, you Jew son of a bitch, you lousy motherfucker, go home." You couldn't hear it, but you could see it. And so Tom and his daughter Judy didn't just inhabit different times. They inhabited different planets. I suppose among her favorite movies would have been Bonnie and Clyde, where when you come out of the movie, you're kind of sympathetic with two criminals. Because the last scene of the movie was the automobile they were in when the police opened fire, hundreds of rounds, turned their bodies to mush. And perhaps coming home. John Voight played the part of a paraplegic Vietnam vet who was in a VA hospital, and Jane Fonda, who was married to a captain in the Army who was in Vietnam, was working, volunteering her services, as the wives back home on military bases almost always did. And they fell in love. And when Bruce Dern came back, decorated with ribbons that he knew he didn't deserve, and he found out that his wife was involved with another vet, there was an unforgettable scene where Dern is just losing it, and he's got a weapon on him, and it's loaded, and God, he's going to kill somebody, screaming at his wife, and Voight shows up. He's frightened about, he knew that he was back and something terrible could happen, and he enters the apartment in his wheelchair, and he talks Bruce Dern down. He says, "Man, we're not the enemy. We're not the enemy." So I don't know what her favorite movies are, but my guess is that those two would have had quite an effect on her. Representative songs, Arlo Guthrie's Alice. If you haven't heard Alice's Restaurant, you've got to hear Alice's Restaurant. It's about 20 minutes long, and it is a hoot. But then there's Bob Dylan's famous "The Times They Are A-Changing." There's the Beatles, "Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds." Everybody thought that meant LSD, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. Apparently it didn't, but it's a good story. Sly and the Family Stone, "I'm Gonna Take You Higher." Let me tell you, it's a long, long way from "I'm gonna buy myself a paper doll" to Sly and the Family Stone singing "I'm gonna take you higher." And there was nothing in Tom's life that would have prepared him to bridge that gap. And there's nothing in Judy's life that would allow her to understand someone who had come through the Great Depression. Or even World War II was Battle of Thermopylae. She was born in 1948. The representative entertainers of the 1960s were Bob Dylan, Joan Baez, the Beatles, Crosby, Nash, Stills and Young, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin. I was born in 1940. And my mom and dad shared the same musical taste. Every Saturday we would watch Your Hit Parade. And we'd watch Snooky Lanson and Giselle McKenzie sing all the songs that made the week. And How Much Is That Doggy in the Window? Woof, woof! and Tennessee Waltz. Well, in '54, I was a freshman in high school, and the one big volcanic eruption was the Supreme Court, Brown versus Board of Education in Topeka. But I'll tell you, there was another revolution and volcanic eruption. Bill Haley played Rock Around the Clock. And from that point, my parents' generation stuck with Guy Lombardo. God. And we went off, eventually with Sly and the Family Stone, Jefferson Airplane. Where do they get these names? What happened to the Mills Brothers? As I was working on this presentation, it occurred to me that there's a real exception to that. That was the Lawrence Welk Show. That continued. And by the way, your hit parade lasted about 4 more years. '59, it was over. Can you imagine Snooky Lanson doing Long Tall Sally? But what about Lawrence Welk? Well, I looked up some things on Lawrence Welk, and Lawrence Welk's show remained broadcast sponsored by Dodge, the Dodge automobile, until 1960. So it lasted about 5, 6 more years. But then it continued. PBS took it over eventually and serialized it. But even before that, it remained live TV. But Dodge backed out. And instead, it was brought to you by Geritol, Sominex, Seritan, that was a bowel helper, and Polident. So, as I look back on these 2 generations, one of the things that strikes me is that everything that I've said has had and does have important exceptions. Within the baby boomer generation, there was a strong counter pressure to the counterculture, even within the college community. But there was also a very growing distance emerging between the college educated and those who were not college educated. And the issues that the 70s, the 60s and 70s anguished over have not disappeared. That great divide between these 2 critically important generations continues to bedevil us today. Thank you.